Hello everyone, this is Joe, and on this video I'm going to give you a walkthrough of this build that I did for my new hunting bow. I've built a few bows out of log staves like you see here, but this is the first one that I've built completely on my own and for the purpose of hunting specifically and not just seeing if I could make a bow. So the first step with this is a hickory bow. As you can see here that I'm taking off all the bark and the cambium, which is that dark spongy layer beneath the bark. And I did this mostly with a draw knife and a card scraper. And at the end of it, the objective was to get all of that off so you have a completely bare, bald hickory stave. And I went ahead and stripped off the bark and cambium of all of the other staves that I had too, which made for great kindling material, as you can see there. Now, the bench that you see here is called a shaving horse or a bowyer's bench, which would be more appropriate for this build. And we did another video on the build of that bench specifically. You can see that link in the description. The next step was to draw out the outline profile of my bow. As you can see here, it's a 64-inch bow. It tapers halfway down the limb to a very narrow point at the tips. Now what I'm doing here is just cutting right at the tip of the bow using a chop saw, because the stave is obviously longer than I needed and the ends were glued, as you can see right here, to keep the stave from splitting as it dried in the shop. Now that I have a stave that's the length that I actually need it to be, I'm going to put it back onto the bowyer's bench and get back to work. Now at a lot of points in this video you're going to see me struggling, to be honest. You're going to find that I had to figure out some things and kind of had to make do with some of the situations that I had. One of them is that my bowyer's bench wasn't extremely good at holding the stave down as I tried to work with it, so I often had to supplement with a clamp. Not to mention, some of my tools aren't as sharp as they should be. I'm hoping that later on in this video I got better at keeping my tools sharp, but they still got the job done. So what I'm doing here is just starting to remove wood with a draw knife until it's about the same profile as those lines that I have drawn on the stave. This is basically the point where you're simply shaving away anything that's not a bow. I found that using a rasp also worked well for removing portions of wood that were difficult to get with the draw knife. And after using the rasp, I would go back with a card scraper to smooth out the rasp marks. I must say that using the card scraper is an extremely satisfying experience, just watching those thin little curls of hickory wood form right under your fingertips. So at this point, the profile of the bow is finished, and you can see here all I would have left is the section for the handle right there, which I'm not going to do right now. Now, even though the profile is cut, you can tell that the stave is way too thick to bend, so the next step is going to be thinning down the stave and removing large pieces of wood until we get it to a point where the bow can actually bend, at least enough to get the next step going. So I'm marking a new thickness for the bow with a compass right here. I'm purposefully overestimating right now. Even where the compass marks are, that's still way too thick, but you can always remove more wood later, and so I just wanted to be cautious as I didn't want to have to start this bow over again and again and again. So the next thing I needed to do was remove a lot of wood to get the bow stave down to those lines that I drew with the compass. This would be an insane amount of work to do with the rasp or the draw knife, so I took the saw and about every 6 or 8 inches I cut down just above that line that I drew, and then I had planned on taking a chisel and breaking off those chunks to get a lot of wood off at once. And obviously the first technique that you see here with the draw knife and trying to go down on the floor worked horribly, so I ended up taking it outside, clamping it down to a bench, and trying again from there, which worked out better. But once again, you're watching me make a lot of mistakes and screw up and learn from the screw ups. It does work out in the end, I can tell you that, but this was probably one of the roughest points, was figuring out how to get these pieces of wood off. Now you may be wondering right now, where's the handle? At this point, my plan was to actually take another piece of wood and laminate it in the middle to make a thicker handle than what I had space to do on the bow. We'll talk more about that later. After chipping off the wood with the chisel, I went back with the rasp to smooth out the rough cuts of where the saw was and the chisel marks. So this is just simply sanding down and smoothing down the bow to get it to a point where it's more uniform, and then reevaluate how well it bends. So I took another stave that I had decided was not going to be turned into a bow because it had too many knots, and I cut off a piece the length that you see right here, and that is going to be hopefully the laminated piece in the middle of the bow that I'll carve into the shape of the handle. And once again, I asked Rhea not to include some of these clips because this is just horrifying technique, but this is my attempt to try and get the, oh my gosh, I don't cut my fingers. I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to cut my fingers, even though it really looks like I'm going to. But this is my attempt to get this piece of hickory flat so it's easier to laminate. Oh my gosh, all the smoke. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Okay, well, there's definitely better tools for that. I didn't have them. There was probably a better technique that could have been done with the tool that I had, and I didn't have that either. So I went ahead, anyway, I got it in place, and then proceeded to flatten out as best I could the section that I wanted to have the handle laminated onto the bow. I tried a belt sander, I tried shaving it down, I tried the rasp, and unfortunately, it just didn't work out well. There was always gaps. It wasn't perfectly flush no matter what I could do. So I decided to just go for it after a while. After rasping and rasping and rasping and sanding and trying to make it flat, I just could see that I just couldn't make it flat. I didn't have the tools to make it completely flat like I needed. So I just decided to go for it. I used Tight Bond glue. Way too much glue, by the way. Like if ever you ask for mayonnaise on your sandwich, don't have me make it for you, because this is how much I'd probably put on there. And you're going to see in a second that it is way overkill. But again, we're learning, and it's fun. It's fun to learn in a project like this. Way too much glue. But it did work. As you can see here, the next day it was nice and laminated on there. So was the frozen wet sawdust on the picnic table that you see me scraping off right there. So at this point I was realizing that since the back of the bow was curved, a compass, it was very difficult to get a consistent width with the compass anyways, and I found that I almost did better if I just eyeballed it and used my hands and my fingers to just get the line as straight and consistent as possible. So I just decided to keep doing it by feel rather than by a tool, since the wood is very organic. You know, it literally is just a log off of my land. So there's not consistency. There's no parallel lines, and you really do have to build it by feel. And as I went along, I got more and more confident of just building this bow by feel. So at this point, I want to explain what the next portion of this build is going to be, and that's the fire hardening process. Once I have the bow to a point where it's basically formed and bending, I put it on a form and I'm going to put it over heat, in this case, charcoal briquettes. And the reason that I do this is to plasticize the wood fibers on the belly of the bow. The belly of the bow is the side of the bow that faces you as you're drawing it. Now, hickory is an excellent bow wood because it's very strong in tension, which means it doesn't snap easily. So when you're drawing that bow, it's less likely to explode on the back of the bow due to tension. However, it's not very good in compression, which means as you draw that bow back over and over time, it tends to take on that D curve that a bow makes when you draw it, and it doesn't reflex back to its original position, which obviously makes your bow less powerful when you're releasing arrows. So fire hardening combats this. As you apply heat to the belly of the bow, it plasticizes the wood fibers and makes them more resilient to compression. So when you release your arrow and even de-string your bow, ideally the bow springs back to its original position. That's what we're doing here. I started with some low heat to just dry the bow, and then the objective was to actually fire harden it and get it dark. But as you'll see in a moment here, I had never tried this before, and I made some mistakes. So I got to interrupt the video to explain a mistake that I made and what I'm changing moving forward. So this is the bow, and as you can see, it got kind of toasted. The plan was to just dry the wood first before fire hardening it. Fire hardening it would have resulted in this color all across the limb. That's what I wanted when I was fire hardening it, but I didn't want to fire harden it yet. And you can see that there's some spots where the wood started to split and the handle started to pop off too. And I think that it's because I simply applied too much heat to this too fast. Like I fire hardened it accidentally when I was trying to dry it. So I went ahead and I carved out a new bow, and I carved this one out with the handle, with enough wood in here that I can just carve a handle from that. So there's not a laminate glued on handle this time. And what I'm going to do, you can see that I've got a lot less coals, a lot less charcoal in the trough here. So there's a lot less heat hitting the wood right now. And the objective is to dry it slower with a lower heat. I'm going to babysit it a lot more than I babysat this one. And then once it's dry, I will then go through and do the fire hardening process afterwards. And the last thing I'm going to try changing this time is I'm going to move the clamps as I'm drying it, because I have a theory that the splits in this bow happened where the clamps were. And so I thought if I move the clamps here and there while it's drying, that'll be less likely to happen. And when I do the fire hardening process, I'll only clamp the ends so that it stays to this form and keeps that back flex. Okay, so bow has been on the form and over coals for almost 2 hours. And I've tried to keep it pretty low. I've Noticed no color change on the wood on the underside yet. And it's running about, been trying to keep it about 200 to 250 degrees when I measure the surface temperature of the bow, which is about there right now. And I've been putting, when all the coals have ashed over, I've just gone ahead and put on a thin layer. You can see here like a spotted layer of fresh new coals to try to keep things consistent. And if it was feeling too hot, then I would put one of those blocks on the cinder blocks, raise it up a little bit. Seems to be working well. There's no cracks, there's no burn marks on the bow yet, which is what I'm going for right now. I'm just trying to dry it. And so we'll see how it looks when we're done, because that is the last of that bag. That was 16 pounds I've used over the course of going for 3 hours. Holds it a lot better, for sure. So this was a lot like it was bendy and wavy and crooked and twisted before it went into the drying process over the fire. And now, can you see that that's not twisted as much? And you can see that it's pretty straight. I want it to actually bend backwards, but that was a good first step. And it'll do that more so when I put it back on the form and put it back on for fire hardening, which is basically doing the same thing, but at a much higher temp. And I actually want this to start turning a dark, like chocolate brown all the way across. So I'm not going to put any clamps in the middle. I'm just going to put clamps at the end to hold it on the form. We'll put it over some hot coals, monitor it and make sure we're not actually burning the thing, and adjust the height if it's too hot or too cold. And then when I take it off and let it cool, then I'll clamp it, make sure it's actually hugging the form, and let it cool that way, and hopefully that'll keep the back set that we want. Okay, we're at about 50 minutes now, and the bow, I can't do this with one hand. Okay, well, the bow is a very light brown, and I've been wondering if it's too high and actually could go lower. So I have these sticks at like different levels here, and I'm going for like a shade of brown to have darkened to after about 10 minutes. And you can see this one's getting a very light brown. It's been on there for about 5 minutes, and so is this one. That one's getting about a light brown too. Oh, dropped a splinter in there. So I think that the bow could actually drop much lower, like probably to maybe, I'm going to try it at 1 2x4 above the cinder block, and we'll see how that goes. There we are, only a 2x4 off the cinder blocks. I have the coals piled higher on each end because the tips flex up. So trying to kind of follow the contour of the bow with heat, and I need more heat at the tips than I do in the center because the center is so much closer. And you can see like it's really low now. I'm going to watch this very carefully every 5 to 10 minutes, make sure that I'm seeing progress, but not too much progress. Well, I'm glad I came out here and checked after like 5 minutes, because that is pretty hot right there. That's like, I don't want it to get any darker than that. So I think I'm going to need to move it up and move the coals around. That's way too hot at the tips. So I got to spread it more close to the middle and move it up. So I moved the coals more center here, and right above those logs, the pieces of firewood there, is where it got too dark. Too dark, too fast. So I moved the coals in the center here, and I put these firewood pieces under those to try and keep it from getting too cooked in that one spot. Of course, I can now see the firewood is smoking, so this might not be a long-term solution. Okay, update. I decided to go ahead and take it off the coals and just stop there, because this looks like the dark spots I really don't want to get much darker. I'm not 100% sure that this is as done as it's supposed to be. because I don't see much browning coming down here. I see a little bit. But like I see a little bit of some cracking right there. It's still hot. I went ahead and clamped a couple parts that were still hovering above the form. And my thought is, since I've never done this before and this looks pretty good, I'm going to stop there while I've got pretty good at the risk of screwing it up. So I'm going to just let this cool in the form overnight, and then we'll see how much backset it holds after it's cooled. The bow did end up holding its backset on the form quite well. I forgot to get a good shot of it, but you can see the curve right here in this carving shot. Without having a piece of wood separate to the original stave being laminated on, it was a much easier job to carve out the handle section for this bow, which I primarily did with a rasp. In addition, I decided to add some reinforcements to the tips of the limbs where the strings would be hanging on. I didn't want the strings to potentially wear through the wood over time, so I added some whitetail deer antlers and laminated those on the tips of the bow. Then cut them to size and took the rasp to them to get them to shape. The tool that I'm using here to cut the groove for the strings is actually just a chainsaw file. So what I'm doing here is the real work. If you didn't think the prior shots were any work, this is where the real work of bow making is in. This process is called tillering. And what you do is you have a string from limb to limb, as I put on here, and all we're doing is making sure that the bow bends evenly. And the way I'm doing that is I put it up on the rack right there, give it a few tugs, and if I see a section of the limb that looks stiff, I remove more wood from that portion. And this just goes on over and over and over. And all the while I'm trying to keep the bow bending evenly, I'm also watching the weight it takes to pull the bow and how far I can pull the bow at that weight. Now my objective here was to do a 55-pound pull at 29 inches. And I got pretty close to that. You can see here that it looks pretty even. There are a couple stiff spots in there, but we're not done yet. And all of this that I was removing the wood with was a card scraper. So it's a very long process. It's rather tedious, but it's actually really rewarding because you do see the bow really go from a stick to a weapon. Up to this point in the tillering process, I had been using a string that was longer than necessary to flex the bow on the rack, affectionately and appropriately called a long string. But I was eager to get the string to the right length so I could actually string it as it normally would be when I'm hunting. As you can see here, though, it was not nearly close enough in bendability to actually string it, and I was really struggling. I eventually did get sort of it strung on a short string, but you can see that the brace height on this, that is the distance from the handle to the string, is like 2.5 inches. So back to tillering work so that we could actually get a proper brace height on the bow. It's all part of the process. I'm not showing you this to say, here's how a master makes a bow. I'm showing you this to say, here's what it's like screwing up and figuring it out as you go and eventually getting a good result. So even now, when I finally was able to get a string on the bow with the help of a string assist, which as you can see still took me a couple tries, the brace height was still a little bit low. It should be meeting the tip of my thumb right there, but it allowed me to at least see more areas that were starting to be stiff. And a lot of this, actually all of this really is just the feel. You can feel where things are curving. You can feel where the limb is thicker and more wood needs to be removed. Those are going to be the sections where your bow is not bending as smoothly. So The tillering process continues. Just find stiff spots, remove some wood, find stiff spots, remove some wood, and on it goes. Right there, I'm showing the camera the shape of the bow to show you that it hasn't taken on some string follow. But I like that in that shot you can see that the bow, it's not factory straight. It's got some wiggle, it's got some curve to it, because once again, this is a stick. It's very, very, very organic, and I wanted to keep that. So after a lot of tillering work, you can see that I was able to start pulling the bow back just with a normal form. It's still quite heavy, so more wood needs to be removed to get it to a point where I can actually shoot it. But it's getting a lot closer, so it was important to not remove a lot of wood in between each flexing on the tillering rack right here, because if I go too far, then that bow will not have the weight that I want it to have when it's finally done. So what you're about to see here is a little bit of a jig where I just taped a piece of a pencil to a piece of wood, and I draw it along the curve right here. And it's a pretty shallow mark. Sometimes I have to adjust it, as you can see. But the idea was that if it didn't touch the wood in some areas and did touch the wood in others, then those areas where the pencil did touch the wood weren't bending as much, and those were the areas that I needed to remove wood from. Again, never past 55 pounds. This point you can see me at about 28 inches, which is probably a good point to see if I can pull it back and shoot. Well, I hit the target, but that was just a practice shot anyway, so I figured it was time to get the rest carved into the handle. I did not want to do shooting style where you shoot the arrow resting on your knuckle. I didn't think that would make for very consistent shots, so I decided to carve a rest right into the handle of the bow. So I'm doing my final smoothing and shaping of the bow right now, which does remove a little bit more wood, so I figured that if it was 55 pounds at 28 inches when I started this process, it would probably land around 50 pounds at 28 inches after I had finished. So that's why I didn't stop tillering when I got to 50 pounds and instead stopped at 55, because I knew this was going to be one more finishing phase here. Okay, special note here. I did etch in with my wood burning pen the month and the year that I finished this bow, and also the word prevail, which has been a significant word in my season of life as of late. I also enjoy doing some leather work, and so I had a nice piece of leather that I shaped to the contour of the bow and decided to do a white thread cross stitch in the front, which just looked so sharp, I think. prior to putting on this leather handle here and finishing off the bow, I had coated it in several doses of Danish oil to give it a nice protective sheen. The felt that you see me adding on to the arrow rest here is just to decrease friction on the arrow shaft as you're drawing them and pulling them back, and wearing out the wood of the bow itself. And what I'm using is just Velcro. It's just adhesive Velcro, just the fuzzy side. I am pretty happy with how this turns out. It definitely is a beautiful looking bow, but of course, does it shoot? So that's pretty satisfying to watch back. I am really happy with how this bow turned out. I am definitely confident in taking it deer hunting this year. Wish me luck. And if you have any questions about the build or anything that you saw here, please let me know in the comments section. I'm not a master bow builder. This is probably the 5th one I've ever made, but it's definitely the best, and I feel more confident in the process. So I'd love to hear any questions or comments that you guys have to say. Thank you again for watching.